So the first thing to say simply is thank John and Jacqueline Chutkowski. They had the bail money last night. Perhaps I shouldn't admit that, and if you want a good story later, ask John Ligo that story. And I'll leave it at that. You can never tell who'll show up at your house and ask weird questions. So this is a simple story. It's a simple message. Usually I bring my own music. I don't mean that badly. I played with a band for 40 years. It's known as the band that plays history. That's the band that played the National Park Service's 100th anniversary, 24 songs, each one dedicated to a story in a different national park. And the Park Service gave it a standing ovation and said, "This is amazing." So what we learned about the story of this, which is tailored for Aka, is simply put, the stories and the music all go together. So Angus should be proud. He may not know it, but the Scots are the key to a lot of the whole story. It is phenomenal. And it really is an amazing story. So I want you to start simply and just enjoy yourselves. This is a story, and if you want to question what I say, on the list I gave each one of you is a reading list. I only gave you 2 pages of books. There's actually about 3.5 pages of books, but that's enough to keep all of you occupied for sure. But get a chance to read them and reflect on what they say and what they are, because they truly are who we be. And that's usually what we call this presentation. Who be we, or who we be? Who are we? And for Highland breeders, we're at the middle of the core of the whole wreck of who we be, because the Scots were the people who did it. Welcome to 1680. It was a damn good year. The king felt nice about what he was going to do, and he was tired of the fact that hearing the Spaniards and the Portuguese were getting rich, the French had done very well, New Orleans, etc., trying to get themselves established in the New World too. And so England decided they needed some commerce, and some very adventuresome Scotsmen and a couple of English investors got the king to charter a company that those in the West called the Bay, which was the Hudson Bay Trading Company. And the Hudson Bay Trading Company decided it would go west and do what it could do and make money. And they needed people who could travel, who could speak, and people who could do cartography and geography. And so a whole lot of the persons who set up to do that and left there just happened to be from this little place to the north of England called Scotland. And the story is the story of all of us in rural America. And it's a phenomenal quote, and it's a hard thing to believe how old it is. Here's what they wrote. "Unless the system of law and policy, which places the preservation of deer and other game above the production of food, and which permits and encourages depopulation of the country, for the pleasure of the wealthy of this and foreign nations is completely reversed, the decline of our population will rapidly accelerate. The younger men and women will, in increasing numbers, immigrate to the colonies rather than continue to bear the evils and abuses they tolerate." Welcome to 2023. That's a 300-year-old quote, and that's what all of us are seeing today. Angus lives with it every day. We talked about it at supper last evening. John Ligo and I visited about it. It's exactly what's going on. But what Scotland provided the Hudson Bay Company was a willing, capable, and able workforce. And they also just happened to be drovers, which was a handy thing at the time. There were no records at all of Highland cows to the East Coast. There's 2 reasons. Early on, because 1, they were not a triple-purpose animal. I like listening to Angus talk about dual-purpose animals. In reality, what we were looking for was triple-purpose animals. They had to do draft, milk, and beef. And the drafting was really important. That was horsepower. The pictures you see of the oxen over there are a really significant part of all of our history. And Highland cows did it well when you put them to draft use, but normally what they were was other animals. We used the cattle that were originally called Teeswaters, which is the original name for the Teeswater River, where the cattle that we call Durhams, which became Shorthorns, are from. It's a phenomenal thing to have the discussion with 4-H kids. When I smile politely and say, "Tell me, what is your Maine Anjou?" And the Maine breeders look at you and say, "It's a Maine Anjou, it's from France." I said, "No, it's not. It's a Durham Mansell. It's half Shorthorn and half Mansell from North France. The breed was created in 1909 to answer the question of fat." What are the 4 purposes of livestock, of cows? What are the 4 reasons? I have never in 30 years had a person I judged in a fair answer that question or in a show. The first, of course, is draft. The second, of course, is beef. The third, of course, is milk. And what's the 4th purpose? The one Americans miss. Who survived the potato famine? What was it?
Fat.
It wasn't fat, that's a byproduct, but the real purpose for the fourth cattle was what the people who survived the potato famine in Ireland knew. They'd worked for the French Foreign Legion, and in Africa they learned what a bleeder was for. You pop the vein on their neck and take your blood and mix it with milk, and that's your protein. And the people who could do that were priceless in Ireland during the potato famine in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, and the same in Scotland later. That's what they did. So there are four purposes, and we have forgotten our history. We do not know who we be, and we should. So the Scots and the Highland coups ended up right in the middle of the whole program, which is amazing. So 1681, we left England and headed west to set up camp. And what are the two forts we created in 1681, and they're both still there? They're on the Hudson Bay, which England laid claim to, much to the objection of the French. And the names of the places were Fort York and Fort Churchill. Churchill's where you go look at polar bears today, and Fort York is 7 miles down the bank. And they're still there. And from that point, you learned a simple lesson. Angus Mackay and Wally could not go because they didn't want anybody rowing canoes, paddling their boats, or doing trade or doing trapping that weighed more than 9 stone 2. A stone is 14 pounds. So if you weighed more than 125 pounds, you could not go because you were too hard to feed, you ate too damn much, and you weighed too much in the trade canoe. So we could not go. Life was good. We got to sit home in Scotland and England and other places and put our feet up and reap the pleasures. But everyone else was tiny. But a lot of the people who came as traders, came to trap, and came to speak languages, and came to do what the Hudson Bay Company wanted to do, much to the chagrin of some other people. So while the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the French, and the English were doing very well, the Italians couldn't quit fighting long enough to find a foothold in the New World. But the other royal family in Europe decided they wanted a piece of the pie too, but they wanted the thing they traded most: jewels, minerals, and furs. And they had a simple solution. So the odds-on bet, and do not be surprised, the first Highland cows in North America were probably bought by the Russians. That's a shock to most everyone. 1734, Russia laid claim to Alaska from their south and ended up with their southernmost fort at the Russian River in Northern California, and laid claim to that part of the coast. And in the process, after 1734, they decided they should establish a few colonies, not just trappers and traders. So the first church service on the west coast of the United States that was not Catholic and not by the Spaniards was in 1741 off Kenai, Alaska, on a boat called the St. Peter's. And it was Russian Orthodox. Would it surprise you that 200 and some years later, there are 21,000 people in Alaska who are Russian Orthodox religion, and there are 90 parishes there? It should not surprise you. But our focus on some cows was first for the people that were going to settle in the 1750s and not just trade. We need dairy product. We want to be able to milk cows. We want some beef on the side. But what we needed was the P word. And this is the theme today: practical. What a Highland cow would do that nothing else would do would eat that crap that was on the islands in Alaska. The stuff in North Scotland is just bracken, it's just bushes part of the year, etc. It prunes those. And a Highland cow had armor. They had horns. So they could say, honestly, lions and wolves and bears, oh my. And they were there. Twice this spring, I watched a cat on a bull. 2 different mountain lions, 2 different bulls. The Montana Department of Transportation drives into a state park, and here's a 140-pound mountain lion on the face of one of my Highland bulls, clawing the hell out of it. The bull won both times, and 2 different cats, but the nice part is most cows could not do that. They don't have the hair and they don't have the horns. And what we had was practical cows. So it would be no surprise that what the Russians may have done is stopped on the little islands to pick up a few dairy cows, because the ones off Scotland and in the Channel were better than theirs. Maybe 1 or 2 from Jersey, 1 or 2 from the Isle of Guernsey, a couple from Holland in the form of what the Dutch had, which were Hollensteiners, Holsteins, etc. And probably at the same time, we could have stopped in the Orkneys on the West Islands from there and picked up 1 or 2 of the other cattle that could be draft and could be beef very easily. And so it appears if you go today to Alaska and talk to some of the people who were very elderly, there's all sorts of old rumors. There is no written record of the Highland cows going to Alaska. But I want you to know we have the DNA. And we have the horns, and we have the heads, and we have the live animals. Take yourselves to Sandpoint Island, Alaska. There are 500 cows on that island that ACA kept from death in 2005. The US Senate, US EPA, and the governor of Alaska wanted to kill all of them. It's to be a bird sanctuary. These cattle should not be here. Sandpoint, Andorak, Amachitka, and Kodiak all have highland-based cattle on the islands. Kodiak's a little purer to the gene pool because they took them there. There's pictures over there in the 50s and the 20s and the 30s to raise island coos because they thought they're the only thing we had that could survive on the diet. They would eat the things nothing else would eat. They were browsers, not just grazers. And they also had armor. So they could deal with lions and wolves and bears. I'm sorry I forgot to say, oh my. But that's the truth. So what we focused on was practical. And it's interesting to this day, if you go there from the 30s and 40s and look at the old pictures, sure enough, they look like a Highland cow, some with a white face, some with more white belly, some with a splotch or two of white on the hip. The dairy influence is clearly there. But they look like what you raise. They just are different in the sense of there's enough other things that got mixed in over the years, but they are very bulletproof, very indestructible, and be very careful. They will hunt you. When National Geographic sent 4 people to photograph them in the 1970s, they went on the beach and scuba gear from the boat, got up, walked on the beach, and one bull ran them into the ocean. But that's because they don't know what people are. They don't. But if you know anybody who fishes in Alaska, there's a not often told story from as early as the 1860s, before the gold rush started, about this. Alaska fishermen have a novel concept of surf and turf. And I know some fishermen who'll tell you this well. If you've got a 1,500-foot purse line for your seine net, if you stop close to one of the islands where the cows are wild, they're all feral, and you send your shark gun to shore in a boat, it's an amazing thing how this animal tipped over and ended up with this rope hooked onto it, and we drug it out to the boat. Fresh seafood and fresh beef to go with it. And I have a couple guys I know who ranch in Montana who also run fishing boats 4 months a year in Alaska. And they've been doing this for more than 50 years. So it's not a surprise that it appears that probably the place the cows got here was not the Scots, not the English, not the Americans. It may well have been the Russians. And talk about a grass-fed gene pool. That's why we saved them in 2005, and ACA was in the middle of helping do it. Because the American Livestock Breeds Conservancy listed Highlanders as a threatened species, and we said, wait a second. These guys have lived on their own for 200 years, plus or minus some. Here they are. They get no hay, no grain, no interference, no tractors, no nothing. And you talk about grass-fed to make that something can prove it can do it. Those were the cows. So it appears, not from the written record, but from the record of the rest, what may have done Highlanders here in the first place was not the Hudson Bay Company. It may have well been the Russians. And the fact they are still there and they look the part and the DNA matches the part well enough, that's what it does. The person who did a lot of the research to find the records was Ann Milbrook, who's a history professor at Montana State University in Bozeman. She retired now, but when we went through the 2005 drill of try to save the cows, she did a lot of the records, and what she wrote helped us get the US government and the governor of Alaska to back up and say, maybe we shouldn't shoot all of these. So they did not. So it's delightful that they're there, and they're still a pain in a lot of people's neck because it's supposed to be a bird sanctuary, but it really doesn't matter in one sense because they're an incredible gene pool of history. So after the Hudson Bay Company started training, it was a few years later. I agree with Angus's presentation earlier. There are no good records of Highland cows coming to this country really before about 1820 or 30. Most everything that came was triple purpose. It was draft, dairy, and beef. And most everything was Durhams at the time, what we call shorthorns now. They were Teeswaters originally. Mr. Campbell in Scotland is who bred them up and did a whole lot to release them and dumped a lot of bulls there and came up with the Lewings way early, before 1800. But there is not a good record of Highland cows coming here for a couple of reasons. They weren't as big, number one. Number two, they were not the milkers that the shorthorns were, which is what people wanted because they needed that. And they wouldn't pull as much weight. And so that was kind of the reason why there was not a lot of them brought, although Hudson Bay sent a lot of traders. So here's the fail question to every history class I've taught at a number of different places. How many maps and how many journals did Lewis and Clark have with them when they left St. Louis in 1803? How many maps and how many journals did Lewis and Clark have when they left St. Louis? And you are 200 yards from the course that Lewis and Clark went up, because this is the Missouri River, and it's the Lewis and Clark Trail. How many maps and how many journals did they have in 1803? Impressive. None is what you say. And what I tell to the history students is, I'm really sorry that you are all wrong. Here's reality. In 1743, 60 years before Lewis and Clark, two gentlemen who were French-Canadian now by trade, called the Vanneries brothers, they were twins, left the St. Lawrence Seaway, came across the Great Lakes, found the first big river, found the large river they'd heard about called the Missouri, and followed it to the Great Falls of the Missouri in Montana at Great Falls. Wintered there, heard things from some persons that were trading about a thing in Wyoming that now is Wyoming called the Devil's Tower, the religious site, went to Wyoming, saw the Devil's Tower and headed east. And on top of a hill overlooking the Missouri River in what is now South Dakota, they buried a lead plate in 1744. And we found it in 1972 on a hill overlooking the river on the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation, and they still have the plate. Their journals and their maps were bought by Jefferson before he bought the Louisiana Territory from France. So that journal and map was there, and the Hudson Bay Company was quite interested in trading more to the west. And they sent them well-educated Scots persons who worked for them. One of them was most notable, Alexander Mackenzie. And Mr. Mackenzie, at the age of 18, came from Scotland and decided to go across the portion of the land that was to the west of the Great Lakes to get a better map for the Hudson Bay Company, because they were running a fort in Canada called Fort Edmonton, which is what you call Edmonton, Alberta now. But Edmonton was Fort Edmonton for the Hudson Bay Trading Company. So he crossed what became the 49th parallel, basically, found the Columbia, found the Fraser, found Flathead Lake, did a whole lot of other things, mapped the other headwaters end of a little bit of the Missouri River, went back to Fort Edmonton and headed north, and became the first European to see where the biggest river hits the Arctic Ocean, and that river is named after him today, the Mackenzie. And Alexander Mackenzie's journals and maps were bought by Thomas Jefferson in 1799, and they were handed to Lewis and Clark to bring west in 1803. So Lewis and Clark had two maps and two journals of people who'd done it before. Hardly anybody realizes that. That is a deleted part of history. People don't talk about it, but it was the Scots who did it. And Mackenzie was quite thrilled to have done it, and it made a big difference for the Hudson Bay Company. The first cabin in Montana, built by a Scotsman working for Hudson Bay at Libby, Montana. And he wrote his book later, and he really wanted some Highland coos or any coos, because what he wrote was very simple. His journals are easy, nothing but horses to eat. That's all they could find. There was no agriculture, there was very little game except for the buffalo on the plains. No venison, very few caribou, very few elk, very few other deer. And so all they had to eat was horses. But they did that. But the Hudson Bay Trading Company started doing it well. And here's the better part of the story. As they went a little further south and came from Indiana, Minnesota, southern Wisconsin, and came west and got to the plains, all these Scotsmen trading for Hudson Bay looked out and said, "We don't have a medical marijuana card, but look at the grass." They were quite thrilled, because what they had never seen in Scotland was hard grass country. Scotland's grass is well washed. It's very clean, it's very nice, but it's not hard grass country. This is hard grass country in the sense of we have a lot of protein. That's what hard means. So lots of protein, lots of ability to produce livestock, to produce sheep, to produce all sorts of things. So the traders came and saw the hard grass country and went, wow, this is fabulous. This is just amazing that we have all this grass space. So there started to be an interest in the 1830s, the 1840s about what that was going to be, and they did it well. And then it became more important that we navigate properly and figure out what the line is. So if you ran for president in 1840 in the US, you had a simple motto, 54-40 or fight. Would the boundary between the United States and Canada be 54 degrees and 40 minutes north, which is Prince Rupert, British Columbia, or would it be the 49th parallel, which is what it is still today? So the deal was made that the boundary would be the 49th parallel. So from there north was Canada, and from there south became us. However, as part of the trade, the entire Columbia River system is navigable free to all citizens of the United States and the Commonwealth forever. So Great Britain got the right to navigate the entire Columbia for all of its citizens, and so did the US. And on top of that, the Hudson Bay Trading Company got the exclusive right to trade in Idaho and half of the state of Montana. Welcome to the Treaty of 1846, the Boundary Treaty. And they did it well. And that's what they had. But who was in the middle of the trade, of course, were the Scots boys. They weren't looking so much at furs, they weren't looking at that. What they were looking at is we have all this grass space, and as Angus said 30 minutes ago, the peak of the droving trade in many ways in Scotland was 1840. 1845, that was the crest of the crown. And they're in the crest, they're running out of space, they're running out of cows, a whole lot of people want to have parks for deer and other things are going on. Guess what we have west of them? A whole lot of grass, and not very damn many cows to do it. So who shot the buffalo was not just the Indians who could do it better with a rifle, not just the buffalo hunters. Who was responsible after 1855 of shooting a whole lot of buffalo? The ranchers, the drovers, the cowboys, because every one of those bison was eating grass that our cows could eat if we have cows here. So it was sort of an allotment period of how we did it, but that's how we got it looked at. And also then people started looking, if we had cows, what could we do? So here's your first clue to the story. Every name you know as a kid that you heard in the West is a Scotsman. The Chisholm Trail. Chisholm was a Scotsman. Granville Stewart, the man who started out surviving the Mormon War of 1857 because he was a trader, etc., born in Scotland with his brother James, who went north to Montana and settled a whole lot of the cow business and did all those things there. Okay, Stewart's the same way. William Clay, a Scotsman. Murdo Mackenzie, a Scotsman, incorporated a company in 1880 in Scotland. And its brand is still on cows all over the West. Matador Cattle Company was another one, just sold, incorporated Dundee, Scotland, 1880. So the people who started trailing cows, they started looking for ways to get cows moved, and that was the cattle tracks. That was the drover trails, not the drover roads of Scotland. Those were the drover roads of the US. It's phenomenal. Some started in Texas. The war was a lot to do with that. What did you have to do in 1865? 4 cowboys and 10 were black. Nobody talks about that. 2 or 3 or 4 cowboys and 10 were Mex or breed. The other 2 or 3 out of the 10 were white. That's who we be. There was nothing else to do. But suddenly we realized we could perhaps have a market for beef further to the east in the East Coast. So we started trailing cattle north. And then we built the railroads. Dodge City, all sorts of places, got railroad tracks. They didn't want to go west until later. They went all the way across when they joined in the 60s at Promontory Point, Utah. But what we started doing is trailing cattle. But we didn't have a northern rail line. We had a rail line right through the middle. So we had to figure out, what do we do? Oh, are we going to raise cows in Montana? Are we going to raise cows in Wyoming? Are we going to raise cows in Idaho? No, we have a bunch of Scots boys who know how to trail cattle. So the people who worked for Hudson Bay went back to doing what they'd done for centuries before. They found the routes, they found the trails, and they knew what the cows were. And a piece of them that came was the piece that is so independent, so non-dependent on other stuff, and so sovereign unto themselves, is the memory of their cows. It wasn't the Teeswaters, it wasn't the Durhams, it wasn't the other cattle. All of them had the vision of their Highland coos. That's the sign of Scotland. To them, that's what they brought with them as a memory, and that's what they all wanted to have. So by 1865, 4 cattle trails were done, but we didn't start building ranches in Montana and Wyoming. Guess what we did? What we have here is grass. So we take the stuff we pick up that's 2 years old in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of the Indian Territories, now Oklahoma, and we trail them north. And it takes us like 120 days, 115 days. In the words of some of the great drovers, remember, the fastest way to move cows is slow. It's also the most economic. There's two rules the Scotsman had. One is this: I like it when my cow eats grass, especially when it's my neighbor's and he doesn't know it. And also, the best tasting beef in the world is my neighbor's when it's in my freezer and he doesn't know it. Those two rules worked well, but the reason we trailed cattle slow was because they could eat their way north. There was nothing in Montana by 1880, 1875. The bison herds were mostly gone, but we had acres and acres, millions of them, of grass. So we trailed cattle north, and then when they got north, we wintered them not for 1 year, but for 2. The average steer killed was more than 4 years old before 1945. Not 2, not 18 months, 4. So we were trailing 2 years old, 3 years old north to hard grass country. They gained well, they fed fine, they did it nicely, and that was the cow trails. And we did lots of them. And we started to build more railroads as we could, but originally, how did we get cattle from Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho, etc. to market? We had 3 routes. We trailed them east all the way to Omaha, to St. Louis, to Sioux Falls, to Minneapolis, St. Paul. We trailed them. We walked them. The drovers did exactly that for years. Some of them went south to Salt Lake City. It had a railhead starting in the late 1860s, but we had no refrigeration. But we could send salt beef and dried beef where it needed to go, or live cattle. So we trailed some of them straight south. From Royab in Montana to Salt Lake City is 516 miles. That's not very far to trail a cow if you do it slow. But if you do it on a dead run, they lose weight the whole way. But if you do it otherwise and have the right feed to do it, that's what we did. Or you could take them west. What's at the mouth of the Columbia River? Portland. And who had a boat in 1805 waiting to see if Lewis and Clark's expedition got there? The English. They missed it by less than a day. But that was the trade route. So you could either trail them east, trail them south, or trail them west. And that was the market we bid. But the people we had who knew how to do it were not just the vaqueros. The people who were Mexican, Spanish, etc. descent who came from the south were good. It's quite an interesting discussion sometime to go through what we call cowboy jargon. Where our words come from. Who gave you the language that we speak. It's phenomenal. And the Scots did a lot of it. Some of those words came from there. But that's what we did with cows. The whole time we were here, there was one piece of our memory we wanted, was a few island coups. So the person who influenced it the most first was a person who in 1880 incorporated a company called the American Landing Cattle Company in Dundee, Scotland. His name was Murdo Mackenzie. He had 10 investors who invested in the corporation with him to go west. They ended up buying 10 entire townships of land in Texas in one block. That, by the way, is a whole lot of land. A township is 36 sections in size, so 10 townships is 360 square miles. Plus all the federal land around it, and that the Republic of Texas has had too, they could use that. And then from there, they decided to find summer grass. By 1882, Murdo Mackenzie and his ranch had the right to graze all of Region 8 of Montana. Scotland is 30,000 square miles in size. Region 8 is 48,000 square miles. That is everything in Montana between the Yellowstone River and the Missouri. That whole pie-shaped wedge was all the property of a Scotsman's Cattle Company, and it had 3 letters on their brand. If you ever have a chance, find the Evelyn Cameron book, Photographing the West. Ewan was her husband. He was an ornithologist, but she took all these incredible pictures. And on each cow and horse you see in her pictures, there's a brand with 3 digits. Only a Cambridge scholar would understand, and Mackenzie was, what the first digit was. Roman numeral 10 in Texas. The brand to this day is XIT. Murdo Mackenzie, incorporated in 1880 in Scotland. And what he did is more than that. Listen to the quote. This is the saddest part of the story. And simply, this is what happened to Scotland at the time, and it's why we got them. Unless the system of law and policy which places the preservation of deer and other game above the production of food, and which permits and encourages depopulation of the country for the pleasure of the wealthy of this and foreign nations, is completely reversed, this decline of population will rapidly accelerate. The younger men and women will, in increasing numbers, immigrate to the colonies rather than continue to bear the evils and abuses. Murdo Mackenzie came in 1881. By 1885, his crew of 72 was all people who were from where he grew up in Scotland. If you read the shipping records for the Northern Pacific Railroad, finished in 1885, that goes from Seattle to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Chicago, go read the shipping records. You can read the numbers for how many sheep and cattle were shipped. You can't read anything else. Because every person who worked in Billings, Montana, Miles City, Glendive, Sydney, Sheridan, Wyoming, Cody, Wyoming, Powell, Wyoming, was a Scots person who came with Mackenzie and the other persons, and they wrote all the shipping records in Gaelic. And the records are still written that way. I can read the numbers, but I can't read all the words. So who came was those people. That's what they wanted to do. That's what they were after. And in the middle of that wreck, starting, two other things happened that were our cows. As near as I can tell, a gentleman named Fergus in Indiana and Kansas was a Scots cookie maker. They call it biscuits in the old company, but he made those. Ferguson had a herd of buffalo and ended up with a herd of Highland cows. He had both of them because he liked novel things. They had a great deal of money. He also had holdings in New Zealand. And when the buffalo were almost extinct, and several persons that were native decided to save some bison with the persons who were European trappers and traders and European cowmen, and one Mexican cowman decided to save a bunch of cows and a bunch of buffalo. They bought a bunch of these animals in 1889 from Mr. Ferguson. And before that, several years, a gentleman named Biddle from Montana bought the rest of his Highland cows, and they came west. So the first real trace down we have of the actual horn and hair cows showing up in Montana, Wyoming on the line were from those cattle. And Biddle had them till 1912. Part of the fascination and part of the attraction was, look who worked for him, look who worked for the neighbors, look who owned the grass, look who the people were, and look what they spoke in their schools. Many of them spoke Gaelic because they were all from Scotland. So our cows ended up there then, picked by the very people who were the people who came, because what they'd seen is all this grass and the ability to raise cows. So does it surprise you? That's how our cows got here, probably to the continental portion of the US. At the same time, the Russians sold out right after the Civil War of what they had in Alaska, etc. And they left their cows and other things behind. So the records we have says some of their people stayed and they were allowed to per the treaty and the deal, but it appears all the other stock stayed. So while you have this independent process going on in the continental US, at the same time, call it the motley crew, but call it the grass-fed cattle, were probably at the same time proliferating themselves on the coast of Alaska and into the edge of Canada. Not huge numbers, too many bears, too many lions, too many wolves. But on the islands, they had the advantage. There were not wolves. Except for Kodiak, there were not bears. So they were able to make a go of it there. And that's part of the reason why that little independent group sat, not talked about for a long time, except by the fishermen who wanted to have surf and turf. That was where they went there. So Biddle had the cows until 1912, which was amazingly good that he did. A few other persons had some as well. There were very poor records of shipments into Canada. Here's the reason why. Canada is part of the Commonwealth. She's also the Queen of Canada. She was, and of New Zealand, and of India, and of Australia, and of Belize, and the rest. So their shipping records inside the Commonwealth, unless they were kept by the Hudson Bay Company or by the East India Company, are not great. They didn't have duties, they didn't have tariffs, and you also didn't have to go all these other rigmarole to export them there then. So the records are not great for what went where, but it appears there was one exportation that went to New York State and another exportation to Quebec, both of which sat. And the persons in the middle of watching that happen and figuring out what those were also some Canadian cattlemen for the West. Two of them had home in Saskatchewan, and their name, they were twin brothers, was Shoup. S-C-H-O-O-P, depending on how you spell it. And if you read the latest books that came out, Ray Marxer just released his book called Cowboy in a Corporate World. He's the man who managed the Matador Cattle Company, in Montana, etc., for 40 years. And Ray's book just came out, and Ray's sister-in-law's father was Shoup's neighbor. When I interviewed him 20 years ago, he was 92, and he talked about it. So I got a whole lot of the story. So they came from Saskatchewan and brought a bunch of these cows with them. And as well, when Biddle decided finally to sell 1911, 1912, part of his cattle went to the Shoup brothers. They trailed all the way north from the Montana-Wyoming line at Biddle, which never got to be a huge town, but Biddle, Montana was the place. They trailed north from there all the way to Babb, which is 2 miles from Waterton State Park on the Canadian line. The literature we read says Browning. They didn't live in Browning. No, they lived in a place called the Gates of Hell if the devil was a frigid person. I think they have 40 frost-free days a year, maybe. I think the wind, if they turn off the fan, shuts off for about 15 minutes a day. I would tell you honestly, the country on the east side of Glacier Park, where Babb is and Shoup's were, is probably the toughest winters in Montana. It's always colder there than American Falls. It's always colder there than Dell and Lima and Wisdom, and colder there than West Yellowstone. It is tough country, but they ran a bunch of these cows there, and they brought them from Canada, partly from the Quebec herd and from the fascination with them, maybe were the Lindsay family, because Mary Lindsay's cattle in Saskatchewan are a legend all over the place. They kept a lot of them up there too, but there's not a good record. Because there was no reed to keep really good records, I think Angus has the idea. Probably Scotland's records of exportations are not so good, but they have a different problem. Our records in Montana and Wyoming are better because what we did is we branded stuff. And so when you branded it in order to sell it, you'd have to build a sale and a brand record. So Montana has the brand records from the time we were a territory in 1872. So I can find out who sold, what they sold, and what the irons were. But there's only 3 sets of horn brands left that I know of. I think Tom and Cheryl Larson, if you are here, have a set. I didn't see them yet, but if they are here, they have a set. There they are. I know that Stroh's have a set, okay, and I have a set to horn brand cows. And Larson's are the real thing in the sense if they would know how to do it. That's what they run, but that's what they had, but that was who did it. But we did not recognize horn brands in the brand book. So the cows had to be horn branded and hip, rib, or shoulder branded, or neck branded, or hackamore branded as well. A hackamore brand is across the nose. But they had to be branded that way, not just horn branded. So we got ourselves to 1910, 11, 12 with what Biddle had sold and what he did. The other persons who bought him out were amazing. Holmes got some of those cattle at Decker, Montana, not that far away from where Biddle was. I think 3 loads of those cattle went to slaughter in Sioux Falls, South Dakota on the train. The other family who got a whole bunch of them was a family named Decker, who lived at Grant, Montana. Decker's cattle, when they sold them because their oldest boy got killed in a car wreck in 1972 and their father got cancer, was the last load of cattle shipped to slaughter on the Union Pacific Railroad. They shipped them down to January 23rd, 1973. Those cows ran on 30,000 plus acres for years. They'd never seen a person. And the photograph that we have has those cows standing in the stock car, a cattle car, breathing steam out their nose, looking like the gates of hell just opened. 24 below zero, perfectly sunny day, not a cloud in the sky, and the entire train load went and died. But that was the tail end of what the Biddles had had for cows, but that's where they went. So some ended up with Deckers, some ended up with Shoup's, which were there for years and years and years until the late 70s. Some went to Holmes's, who had them for a long time. A few others dispersed to Wyoming. Tom O'Connell may have a better idea where some of them went, but I've been through a lot of the state brand records, but not all of them to find out. But the person who was plugged into that at the time was another gentleman who came from a bit different world than a lot of us run in. And his family built the Great Northern Railroad and all of the resorts in Glacier National Park. The East Glacier Hotel, the Mini Glacier Hotel, the West McDonald Hotel. His family built all those to encourage tourism. And they also palled around with a whole lot of people who helped them build the railroad. The Mary Hill Museum is in Washington State on the Columbia River, and until 40 years ago it had the Romanian crown jewels in a cabinet in the front room. It has the best collection of pictographs and stone carvings from the natives on the Columbia River of anybody in the country. Before the dams were built, Hills got them all given to them by people, and they have all this collection. They have a functioning Stonehenge. The real thing, the size of the real McCoy, but it works perfectly. I have stood in it for the solstice and the equinox. It's at Mary Hill. But Hills were instrumental in being progressive, so the people they palled around with had seen the cows that came to New York in about 1900. Practical names like Roosevelt, Rockefeller, DuPont. That's who Hills were running around with at the time. There's pictures of Walter Hill raising beef cattle for Yellowstone National Park, looking at it with a Scots butcher named McLean, who had the butcher shop in Gardner, Montana. So Walter raised the Highland cows. They went to McLean, they killed them, and that was the beef supply for Yellowstone National Park. A bit of a visionary. He had a hard time finding enough cows and was progressive and had a bit of money standing behind them. So Walter Hill hired a gentleman, A.W. Ross, as an agent to try to procure a batch of Highland cattle from him, for him, from Scotland. So if you unfold your roll, here's what you're going to see. These are not scanned, these are not online. I had a hell of a time finding the Breeders' Gazettes. They are all on file in University of Wyoming's library in the basement. Because I teach for Montana School and University of Montana Western, they let me check them out. So if you enroll them, what you'll find is a copy of the Breeders' Gazettes that matter. Some simple things. One of the first documents is the records of the Royal Show in England, Scotland, when they had 55 island coups. That's 120 years ago, 1903. Now look where we are today. We have almost 500 at the National Western now. But the land where the cows came from had 55 in 1903 or so. So there were not a lot there, but there were some. There were discussions in the record of what's in the magazine. There's a reference to the pages, but that's why I gave you a copy. Look at the cover of the 1903 edition. New York State, Adirondack. Those cattle were in upper New York State where that picture was taken. They don't look much different than they do today 120 years later. That's why I wanted you to have the picture. That's what they were, and that's what they are, and we have kept them all this time. And the Breeders' Gazette was quite intrigued with them because they hadn't seen very many of them. They made great read, they made great cover for the magazine. So as you go through the next issue, what you find is there's an article titled Highland Cows to Montana. A.W. Wasper, Walter Hill, bought 67. And he bought the best in the country. He bought, I think, most everything sold at Oban in 1922, but they cruised the islands and cruised all sorts of places and bought a lot of cattle. Now, if you think that's not a significant issue, think of it this way. Look at the the American Herd Book Registry. You will find the first 5 bulls and the next 42 cows were registered by Mr. Berry. And Mr. Berry bought them all from Walter Hill. So the 67 that came are the first 50 plus animals in our herd registry. So one person did make an incredible difference. And his difference was the gene pool, what we had, what we could do with them. So we had some of Biddle's cattle. And Biddle's were probably not as good in terms of quality for travelability, but they were probably tougher than nails because they'd grown up in tough country. Believe me, southeast Montana is not a cakewalk. But that's what they had, that's what they did. But Walter Hill imported them, got them there, and the beauty of the story is 2 of the students who came with them I met. This is no kidding. What came with the cows was 2 dogs and 3 Scots boys that were 21, 22, and 23 at the time. 2 of them I met in 1974 when I was riding for people for $500 a month in eastern Montana. They were Scots. I had a good visit. I had no appreciation in the mid-1970s of what they'd done. Here was the story. They bought the cows, they put them on the ship, they landed in New York, they trained them from New York to Chicago. They did not have a good link, so they trailed them a little ways north of there. Then they trained them from there to the Twin Cities, put them on the Great Northern Railroad, and trained them to Malta, Montana, and unloaded them there, and walked them south 271 miles after swimming the Missouri, the Milk, and the Smith River. And 3 boys and 2 dogs did that with some cowboys that came from Walter Hill. And they stayed on the place the whole time. I have 3 of their heads. Took us a long time to find out. Walter Hill's grade school teacher, in which barn she told me they would be in, Jim Allison, who's in my list, was a doctor for the Park Service and for all of Livingston. And Doc Allison said, this is the lady to talk to. She's 91 or 92. Go talk to her, Wally. She was Walter's school teacher, etc. And she said, go look in this barn. And sure enough, there were the heads, 3 of them, and there was the horn brands, right on them. So Walter Hill's cows did come. They made a huge difference. That's our basis. That's a whole lot of what we ended up with came from Walter Hill. That's how he did it. That's why he did it. And his reason was to do beef. But the whole word for him was not pretty. It was practical. They could survive the climate. They could survive the feed. They could deal with frozen ground for months a year. Those of you from the east have no idea what 43 frost-free days is. I'm not kidding you. Our grass starts growing in the end of April or May. We will see a freeze every night and change sprinkler pipes July 4th weekend with ice under the sprinklers. Just about every year. And the first frost every year is about August 20th, August 21st, August 22nd, whatever else. So we have 43 days frost-free. Our grass grows May all the way till November some years. That's why we have grass tetanus. Grass does not set heavy metals like manganese, magnesium, etc. until 58 degrees Fahrenheit. We have all this green feed, but it's got no metal in it. So cows develop a form of what almost looks like epilepsy. We call it grass tetanus because there's no heavy metals in it. Their nerves don't work right. The little nerve endings don't fire right. But that's our world. But what Walter Hill wanted was practical cows that could do that. Read Roosevelt's records. Great article, Running Wolves and Bears in Montana. And that's what he did. And Roosevelt was Walter Hill's friend. So at the same time in 1909 that Biddle was getting out, a certain gentleman built a railroad that was mostly electric from Chicago all the way to Tacoma. The Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, St. Paul and Pacific Railroad, called the Milwaukee. And Rockefeller paid for it, and he was brilliant. Because the engines in the hills ran on DC current, not AC, and Eddie McKay will tell you a DC motor running backwards is a generator. So what Rockefeller did is he built it through Ringling, Montana, home of the Circus Winter Range, 21 miles north of Walter Hill's house. And when the train went uphill here, the next train was going down the hill on the other side, because if this train going down ran its motors backwards, they generated the electricity to run this train up. They ran a railroad that way from 1909 to 1985, when they sold it all off in bankruptcy because the Midwest was bankrupt and called it good. The state of Montana could have bought the right-of-way from North Dakota to Idaho for $2 million and would not buy it. Huge loss. But those were the persons that Walter Hill was selling beef with, selling beef to, helping with the project of This Is Created. He also decided there's a huge merit to crossbreeding these cows. So he had a number of shorthorn cattle that his Kidron, his hired man, ripped a bunch of them off and ripped off all their black Angus and all their other Angus. So a lot of those cows got sent through a bankruptcy. It's a great lawsuit, like 50 pages long to read out of the Park County Courthouse. But what he wanted to do was crossbreed them. So he gave a lot of those cattle to the Montana State University in Bozeman. So their livestock judging teams until the 1970s were judging Highland cows. The only college west of the Mississippi River that had Highland cattle for the livestock judging team, and they did it. And they all came from Walter Hill and were kept there for that reason. And he loved the crossbreds because that was the hope of the cows. That's what the article tells you. That's the future. Let's do it this way. This will give us hope for something different for agriculture. So Hill's cattle not only hit the herd book, Barry's bought a lot of their cattle, I know that. Holmes has got some. I think Larson's, Tom is here, but I think Tom's dad got some of them. I think a few of the others went willy-nilly. Some other persons that made a difference. When you look at the record, you'll see that L.C. King's Pride is a registered bull in the record of a lot of people. Why is that? Because a Highland breeder who raised Herefords for 3 generations in Rexburg, Idaho, liked that bull a lot, and he was the head AI tech for ABS breeding services after 1945. So Max Beeler, who's in the list of persons that made a difference, AI'd every Highland cow and every cow he could cross to that bull for about 40 years. In his career, he told me he probably AI'd about 42 or 44,000 cattle. And that was pretty radical stuff to start doing that in the 1950s. That was cutting edge to do it. But Max did that, which is why L.C. King's Pride shows up all over the West. Max got his first 3 heifers that were pure Highland in 1950 by driving his brand new 1949 Chevy truck from Rexburg, Idaho to South Dakota and buying them from Baxter Berry and drove them home. Straight 6, 235, 4-speed, 1949. And Max loved to tell the story when he was alive. But that's how he got his first ones. But he made a sweeping difference in the West because suddenly the ability to AI for people was great. Deckers as well had a whole lot of these cattle that got shipped, and those cattle were there in the 40s, and on my refrigerator in Missoula is an invitation from the Queen to the cattle function in 1951 for Highland cows because he bought his bulls in 51 and 53 from the Queen's herd at Balmoral. His wife had the letter still, and that's how I ended up with it, because when Anne was in the hospital, their daughter was one of her nurses. But phenomenal that they were buying cattle by import, and then when Angus talked about the 20 imported in 1955, Deckers took 1 from that bunch, Berry's took like 4 or 5, Holmes's took a couple, Beeler's took 1, some other people all over the place took those bulls, they went everywhere. But the importation that was the most significant exportation of Highland cows in history from Scotland is written in the Breeders' Gazette, Breeds of Livestock and other places, as the most important exportation of Highland cows from Scotland in history. And it is. And it's our basis. It's who we be. It's how we got here. It's what we did. You look at Stroh's, you look at those people, Larson's, they also had a practical other use. Larson's especially, and some other people I know, raise bucking stock. And Highlands can twist, they can turn, they can knife around well, they'll jump a fence better than an elk. But they crossed a lot of them for bucking stock. So did the people in Idaho. Kessler still run bucking stock out of Lethbridge, Canada, owned all the sawmills in western Montana at one point in time. And I will tell you, I am not proud of this, but personally I'm responsible for killing 34 of the best bulls they owned. Because when the border got closed, they had a bunch of bulls that had bucked the Calgary Stampede, come through Montana to Salt Lake City to both the Salt Lake City Rodeo, and the same cowboys who rode in Calgary rode the same bulls in Salt Lake City, and the border was closed because of mad cow disease. And the head brand inspector in Montana and I figured that out and turned them in, and the US government slaughtered every single bull. Because they could have mad cow. The border is closed. But you know, it's funny how when you have a whole truckload of horses, if the top deck has a bunch of bulls and nobody can see anything there, but the bottom deck's all horses, bucking horses, that's how they got through the border. Not a good time, not a pleasant thing, but a whole lot of their stock ended up with cattle that came from Biddle as early as 1910, 1908. They went to Canada that way, and they crossed those for the bucking stock they run, which is still so good. The guys who ride them hate them. But they did it well, and it was big money and big dollars, and that's what they did. So that's who got them, so that was practical. So if you look at the article on Walter Hill, you'll see a note in the 5th paragraph on the 2nd page. These cows are pretty, and there's no reason why all of our farms and small ranches in New York State and the Adirondacks don't have these cattle. That was the first indication. Instead of practical, we were looking at pretty. And pretty is nice, and they are. But that was kind of a change of the focus. So when you go to Denver and go to other places now and see lots of cows, what you find is pretty is a bit of a focus. But pretty should not be the focus. The focus should also be practical. And that's the last 3 sheets I gave you. I have the pictures of the fields at my house where my neighbors have no Highland cows. 60% of their vegetation stand is knapweed. I have none on thousands of acres. Because my cows eat it. They crave the tannins. Who is it that wrote the rules that became quality Highland beef? Pat Dunn, John Bates, and myself wrote it for ACA, and that became the model for the 3 places that has certification for grass-fed and natural. Montana certified natural, Montana certified grass-fed. South Dakota was second. I wrote your law. South Dakota certified natural, South Dakota certified grass-fed. And the USDA adopted the same rules. So we were the cutting edge for practical, for what's natural, what's grass-fed. That's why the cows in Alaska mattered so much, because they're like the ultimate grass-fed tool. So I think if we focus back on practical for a second, here's what I'd leave you with. We started practical, went full circle to pretty, and we're now going back in the circle to practical. We eat the browse, read all the literature, it says that. We eat the weeds. We're trying to gene splice the oryx back to clean up the forest of Europe. I gave you the brochures on that question. They're in there, some of the literature. But it's phenomenal that instead of gene splicing an oryx back, which is extinct, why not look at the easy way to do it? We have the gene pool in the cow that we have that will do it, so why not use the Highland coos? Well, it doesn't pay you nearly as much money. Germany's been spending $4.5 million a year to try to gene splice Oryx back from Highlanders and Weimara's. $4.5 million a year. So it's so much more fun to support yourself. These guys should have been lawyers, I think, anyway. But what I'm saying is they could use the tool we have, and that's probably a big piece of our future, is practical. Not pretty. Pretty is nice, pretty does well, but practical is the whole key. As Angus will tell you, that's good feet, good travel, good legs, good bodies, good beef, and good market. We also figured out what New Zealand had, the research on diet. Grass-fed beef often tastes gamey, especially when grass is green, because of the protein in grass called scatol. And the antidote is tannins. New Zealand figured it out, and what cows eat tannins? Highlanders. That's why they crave knapweed. So we never have gamey flavored grass-fed because our cows eat the antidote. And most cows do not. So we have a chance to be not just here, we have a chance to not just be who we be, we have a chance to be progressive. The Scots who got us here did it by being progressive. They did it by working for the Hudson Bay Company. They did it by trailing cattle north from Texas to summer grass, that they could gin ship east and make a lot of money. And they did it well. A whole lot of the stuff on the reading list will help you understand a piece of the history. That's what it is. But who we be is our cows. And I'm impressed to see Larsons, because Larsons and Strohs are probably the 2 oldest, most continuous breeders in the country. And Tom and Cheryl are in the back, and they're on my thank you list, because Tom, when I get him to talk, told me a lot of the stories of who did what with Holmeses, etc. years ago. He was much younger then, so was I, so were a lot of us. But it's delightful. So I'd leave you with a simple story, 2 of them. One is a note this. There's a list here of the persons that I said thank you to. I think I got most of them. One is missing. He didn't tell me a lot of the story of the history of the breed or the cows or the people. That is Jim Welch, who was the Dean of the College of Ag at Vermont and New Hampshire. And all he'll tell you is, Wally, you're a terrible race. You should have majored in agriculture, not in law or geography. And he makes no bones about it, but he has a good way to connect the dots. Max and Reva Beeler, they're from Rexburg, Idaho. They're both deceased. Bill Sherrod was from Western Washington, Bellingham. He's deceased. Jack Stroh's deceased. John and David, I talked to David Stroh yesterday on the phone. Howard Lohr is deceased from Medellin Falls, Washington. Bill Baker is from Vermont, New Hampshire. He was great. David Peace was Canadian. Doc Allison is from Livingston, Montana. Jerry Eastman trailed Decker's cows in the 1960s and 70s. He's my mandolin player when we play. He's 85 this year, and boy, he's a damn good mandolin player, but a really good cowboy. Don Badger was Canadian. His wife runs the Canadian Association, I think, still. Bill Stobie was from Washington State down on the river. Fran and Ira Fells were from the Wyoming line. They were great. Mildred Decker was Decker's wife. He was deceased years before I came along, but Mildred was great to talk to. Tom and Cheryl Larson are actually here, which is fabulous, and I tried to get David Stroh to come, but he was working cows or else he would have. And naturally, the other person who kept a lot of the record, of course, was Gina Moses, the keeper of the minutes. So the only other thing I did not give all of you a copy of, this is as current as I can get you. January 2023, take a look at that. Country file. There's 11 pages on Scotland's island coups. What they do, how they browse, how they're great, how they do it well, and what matters. So the way to do the program may not be to say, sell beef. It may be sell beef, but sell a tool. What's wrong with a cow being a tool that cleans up the brush, cleans up the weeds, cleans up the rest? They're a mechanism. The Scots treated them that way. They trailed them for money. They traded in cows first and they got dollars later. They did it well. We have the ability to do the same. Thank you much.